Okay, welcome everybody. Glad to have you here at the conference, and I'm Tommy Kidd, if you don't know me, and I'm the Associate Director of Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion, and I also teach in the History Department here. Philip Jenkins and I co-direct the program on Historical Studies of Religion at the Institute as well, and I want to introduce him for his talk today. Philip Jenkins is Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor and serves with me as co-director of the program on Historical Studies of Religion. Historian by training, Jenkins's work has engaged with many different disciplines, and I do mean many if you've ever looked at his CV, including sociology, criminology, and religious studies. And among the issues that he has been exploring lately in his work is global Christianity, new and emerging religious movements, and 20th and 21st century U.S. history. Jenkins is the author of many scholarly articles and books, and I'll just mention a few. The New Faces of Christianity, 2006, The Next Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, 2011, that's probably an updated edition, I think, and that's probably one of the books that he's the best known for. And one of his most recent books is Crucible of Faith, The Ancient Revolution That Made Our Modern Religious World, 2017. And today he is going to speak on climate history and the remaking of Christianity. So, Philip.
Just to begin with a quote. In short, they have no refuge, nothing to take hold of. All that preserves them every moment is the mere arbitrary will and uncovenanted, unobliged forbearance of an incensed God. You may know that quote. It's from one of the most famous texts of early American history, of American religion. It's Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It was preached a couple of times, but the standard printed version is July 1741. And that era, 1739 to 41, is an incredibly busy, important, exciting time in the history of America and the history of American religion. It is the absolute peak of the cultural religious explosion we call the Great Awakening. You have all these great books. Gilbert Tennant publishes The Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry. George Whitefield does his famous tours, preaching tours of the American colonies in late 1740. He reputedly preaches to an audience of 25,000 on Boston Common at a time when Boston had a population of 17,000. He was pulling in a real lot of people. We don't know about the exact numbers. And clearly it was a time of phenomenal excitement. If you ever have heard about that event, or you've ever read one of those texts, I'm sure that your first question is, so what was the weather like? And, well, I'm glad you asked that, because there is kind of an interesting answer to it. The spring of 1740 was the worst in 500 years. So if you're ever tempted to say, boy, this is, a once in a lifetime, no. This really was bad. This was epic. And if you look at the period 1739 to 41, it's an age of a great spiritual explosion, but also the time of a climate-related catastrophe that echoed through life, politics, economy. And you sort of run out of superlatives when you try and describe this. But to give you an idea, there was, at this point in Ireland, the conditions were so bad. There's a good book on the era that is called Arctic Ireland. Literally, Ireland experienced Arctic conditions. That caused a famine, which killed proportionately many more than the potato famine would in the 1840s. This is a time of catastrophe, and it echoes through the whole system. And you might think, why does this matter so much? And if you're writing a book about the age of Jonathan Edwards and Whitefield, then do you have like a little bit at the beginning saying, oh, by the way, there was really bad weather at this time? Or do you try and put the two together? And you think about the audience that is going to these great preaching meetings, that is going to hear these preachers, and more particularly, is going to hear these preachers and react in such a phenomenal way. You know, every account we have of these great sermons suggests how passionately enthusiastic the congregations are. So Jonathan Edwards basically at points can't get from sentence to sentence because of the terrible noise. Okay? And you think about it in 1740 and 1741, and the lines like, they have no refuge, nothing to take hold of, I'll say. And it seems to me that a crisis like that is going to cause a removal of all the standard assumptions, all the standard beliefs about the world, leaving you to turn to the supernatural. I'm going to make a suggestion in this talk. If you look at the history of Christianity, if you look at the history of religion on a larger scale, it does not proceed at a nice, normal, regular gradient. There are periods of extremely dramatic, rapid change when it almost seems as if the films have suddenly gone into fast forward. And in those eras, like 1739 to 41, everything changes. If you go to sleep in 1738, you wake up in 1742, what? What has happened here? And in evolutionary terms, it's rather like what they call punctuated equilibrium. Things move along slowly. Then there are these very revolutionary moments when things change very fast, very dramatically, and then things become quite stable until the next time along. If you look at the history of Christianity, we can identify a good number of these episodes, of these moments, and a great many of them are connected, like the revival of 1740-41, with climatic change. Very dramatic, very sweeping, often very damaging climate change. Please understand, I'm not standing here saying history of religion is all the story of weather. It's not. But if you leave out climate, you are leaving out a very potent driving force. And this is not just a matter of isn't this interesting about the past? We have to rewrite our histories of whatever. Because as we all know, we are shortly going to be entering a period of significant warming, which will have its greatest impact in the tropical areas of the world, those between 22 degrees, 22 north, 22 south, where we could see very significant climate-related disaster. And that disaster will have its greatest impact on the fastest areas of Christian growth and expansion and Muslim growth and expansion. And it seems to me that in our past, we can see something of the future. This is not a simple case of I can describe these disasters, I can describe these terrible things. They were all terrible. There'll be catastrophe in the future. I brought along a few friends to present this. In that people respond to these crises in different ways in different eras, and there are a number of variables. Technology, obviously, is a huge variable. Nature of media, nature of transportation, nature of government. Depending on all those, one of these climate crises can have a transforming, disastrous effect, or it's something that can be met with reasonable a reasonable degree of acceptance. How are we going to react to the next one? So I suppose I'd like to quote one thing, a quote I love from Voltaire. And when I quote this, you think, and this is ahead of its time. 3 things, he said in 1780, exercise a constant influence over the minds of men: climate, government, and religion. That is the only way of explaining the enigma of this world: climate, government, and religion. I put it to you that our policymakers have spent many years looking at government. They're starting to think about climate, but religion is, well, they'll get there. Why does religion matter so much in this picture? For most pre-modern societies, worldly disasters, climate disasters, earthquakes, floods, whatever, are providential. They reflect the attitude, the anger of God, of divine forces. What happens in that larger natural world is reflecting what happens in the moral world. Any event like the great climate disasters of 1740-41 has to be seen in a moral and religious atmosphere. And when something like that happens, religious believers have got the intellectual resources to interpret it, because they have things like the tradition of apocalyptic. By the way, what is the apocalypse? It's the book of Revelation, which grew out of a climate-derived famine in the 90s AD. Is it any wonder that people in later years go back to these? What I'm going to do is talk about this. I'm going to look at 4 episodes, basically. And each of them represents a way of responding to a climate catastrophe. And if you'll excuse me, I probably should have some elaborately phrased polysyllabic theory for this, and I don't. So I'm just going to put it in real simple terms. And I'm going to look at 4 responses. The first one is that of what I call hating, where a climate catastrophe drives a feeling of anger, of suspicion to the minorities, to those vicious, evil people whose bad behavior so angered God that he punished our society in this way. Stigmatization, scapegoating. I'm going to look at the idea of fleeing. That is, a catastrophe drives government repression, maybe against minorities. It drives rebellions, and people migrate. They flee. And in so doing, they take their particular religious, spiritual, cultural traditions with them. And you can write a lot about the history of the spread of Christianity and particular forms of Christianity in terms of fleeing particular climate-driven disasters. The third model I've already touched on, which is reviving, which is where the response takes the form of a general shift in religious attitudes, the growth of new movements. And the final one I'm just going to call generally dreaming. That is, people look at a world which seems to be at its end. They dream of the end times, they think of the end times, and they envision new worlds. Hating, fleeing, reviving, dreaming. As we look into the future, as we look into the world not of 1740, but 2040, which of those will predominate? Will they mix together? If you were advising a government based on this history, what would you say? And the first period I want to look at is the era round about, it's a late medieval period, around about 1320. At the start of the 14th century, the world entered what's called the Little Ice Age, which lasted for several centuries. We hear a lot about global warming. We know how bad that's going to be, but global cooling was also very, very bad. What global cooling did was it resulted in dramatically shorter growing seasons. It resulted in more ice and icebergs in the seas. It resulted in changes in rainfall, which culminated between about 1315 and 1325 in some of the most horrible, famine-ridden years in human history. To read about these today almost makes you scream. As the commentators say at the time, well, of course, the poor starved and died, but even the rich didn't have enough to eat. And when the rich don't have enough to eat, you know you're in trouble. And I almost advise you not to read the accounts of these years because they're so horrible. We read accounts of, people ate horses, and then they ate dogs, and then they ate their children. The famine was that advanced and that extreme. A famine-starved population is prey then to epidemics. That famine and plague thing and famine, plague, and death go very nicely together, thank you. There are a couple of diseases that you can always tell when these are around, you know there's been famine. Typhus is one, dysentery is the other. People have got no ability to respond. And there are all sorts of other things. So for instance, 1315 is one of the wettest years recorded in human history. What that means is timber is flooded. Timber supplies are waterlogged. Okay, if you don't have wood, you don't have firewood. If you don't have firewood, you can't refine salt. If you can't refine salt, you can't preserve food to last through the winter. So you will die. So the point I'm trying to make is that the years around 1315 to 1325 are horrible years to be alive. How do people respond? Well, think about it. This is at a stage where emigration is not really an option. You don't have the technology, you don't have the politics. So what you do is you turn on your neighbor. And there are three areas of this that we might look at. One, the most obvious one perhaps, is what happens to Christians themselves. Up until this point, up until about 1320, much of the Middle East is ruled by Islam, but in a reasonably tolerant way. People get along. In this era, the decade after 1315, things go horribly bad. Muslims turn on Christians and know that their evil practices and evil faith is what is infuriating God. Christians are driven out of many Muslim cities. Many are forced to convert. The best known example of this is what happens in Egypt, where the year 1321 is absolutely notorious among Coptic Christians. It's almost like the year the world ended. And the stories that people tell at the time sound so modern. Why are the Christians so bad? They're planning acts of mega terror against Muslims. Christians, the Byzantine Empire, they perfected this kind of sophisticated weapon, which we today call napalm. And yeah, they really have, honestly. Muslims are very nervous about this, and they tell stories that Christian agents and Christian monks are wandering the Muslim world, and they're going to plant these giant firebombs that are going to take out the Kaaba at Mecca. They're going to take out the greatest mosques. And the Muslims respond to this threat of Christian terrorism by mobbing and attacking Christians, by burning down their neighborhoods, by sacking their churches and monasteries, and by forcing conversions. This is a catastrophic year for Christian Egypt. If you look at the history of Christian monasteries, many of which have been there since the 3rd, 4th centuries, the history ends in 1321. That year is a caesura. It's a dramatic end. If I ask you to think of Jewish history, there are very, very strong Jewish communities in Germany and France and Spain and the Rhineland and so on. They suffer very severely in the Crusades, particularly in the 11th century, but most of them have come back. It is the 14th century persecutions from the 1320s that really caused the destruction and extinction of so many of those communities. And a lot of ideas that have been kind of in the atmosphere before that point suddenly become mainstream. A couple of hundred years before that, people have got the idea of making Jews wear special symbols. It's round about 1320 that you see Jews being forced to wear yellow stars, and they really enforce it. 1321 is when it's introduced in the Kingdom of Castile, and that law remains in force until 1359. There are so many plots that are recorded in Europe between 1315 and 1325. I'm not going to go over them here. There's a shepherd's plot. There's a leper's plot. There are revolts. There are rebellions. There is mass paranoia. And many of them have as their target Jews, dissenters of various kinds. The ultimate end of the story as it affects the Jews is after the great persecutions, the epidemics, they're driven to safer lands in Eastern Europe, in what we would call Poland and Lithuania and Belarus, which is where the hearts of those communities remain until the Holocaust. Climate crisis, climate disaster reshapes religious geography. It creates the religious geography that we know today. And the other thing that you know from this era is a radical change in ideas of witchcraft. Most societies penalize witchcraft, the idea that, this man is angry at this man, so he put this spell together and did this curse, and he died, and that's why we're executing this man. In the European Middle Ages, an idea grows up, not just that witchcraft is happening on an isolated basis, but that it is an organized movement, an alternative anti-Christian religion, and it should be persecuted not as the work of isolated offenders, but as a heresy. Would anybody care to tell me when the key document in that process happened? 1320. Very precisely. The first witch trial that we know about, which fits absolutely all the later criteria. Pacts with the devil, familiars, women out in the woods dancing, worshipping the devil, is 1324. And it happens in Ireland, and it's the famous case of Alice Keiteler. Oh, and just to bring everything together, what are the witches doing out there? They're celebrating a Sabbath, because the Jews are an anti-Christian religion and witches are an anti-Christian religion, so they both have Sabbaths. As the phrase goes, I don't make this up. So it's a major age for the persecution of heretics, the persecution of witches. That witchcraft idea shapes Christianity in many ways in Europe for the next 400 years. You cannot look at Christian history in the early modern period without looking at that sense of witches and demons and the workings of the devil. And by the way, the other thing that happens in this era is that the images of these alien, evil folk become much more marked. So here we have Jesus being led before Pilate. Very, very familiar image, but this time, look how the Jewish stereotypes have taken over. It's not human beings being responsible for the death of Christ. It is very definitely the Jews. And this leads to the great age of later pogroms and mass killings. So I choose 1320 as my exemplar of maybe the worst possible set of responses, where communities turn against rivals, whether these are real alternative religions, and hey, if you don't have a real alternative religion, make one up. And very seriously, they do. The religious world in 1300 is still a world with many, many Jews in Western Europe, many, many Christians in the Middle East and in China. The religious world by 1350 or 1360 isn't. Christians have been driven out entirely of China, where they'd been flourishing. They've been driven out of large parts of the Islamic Middle East, and the turning points are the climate catastrophe of the Little Ice Age. I could take other episodes, but let me move on to one which, in a sense, so much happens in this story, I don't have nearly time to tell it, but I can just sketch it. If you have any interest in climate and climate history, you very soon make the acquaintance of sunspots. There is a correlation between sunspots and climate. What that correlation is, we can debate. But there is a remarkable period between 1645 and 1715, which is called when sunspots are basically not visible. And that's usually called the late Maunder minimum, after the scholar who described it, the late Maunder minimum, which reached its depth between 1675 and 1685. 1675 to 1685 was one of the worst, coldest periods in recorded history. If ever you look at, records, 1684 is usually the worst. If you look at the worst years for crop failures, famine, starvation, it's the years between about 1678 and 1682. This was not a time you wanted to be alive, and many people were not alive. Many people died as a result of these horrors. And you can map the spread of, guess what, typhus and dysentery. They avoid plague on this occasion, but huge numbers of people die. But I want you to think that through from the position of governments. Yes, you can scapegoat people, and there's a lot of that, as we'll talk about in a moment. But also, you want to keep up your tax demands to make government work, and you're trying to screw more and more money and food out of people who don't have any food. Put this together, and you have an age of revolt, an age of revolution, which, given the characteristics of the time, is usually an age of religious revolt and religious persecution. But there's one big difference from what had happened back in 1320. By 1680, the Europeans have got sailing ships that'll take them all over the world. So if you're being persecuted in France or Germany or England, you can get in a boat and go elsewhere. You and several thousand of your close friends from your religious congregation. So religious dissenters are going to spread over the world. Let me just talk a little bit about this event around 1680. This event is something that happened during the Little Ice Age. You'd love to try doing it now. It's a frost fair on the River Thames. I use the word frost fair, but actually at this point the ice on the Thames was 11 inches deep. So yeah, go and set up a stall, light a fire. It's not going to do any harm. You've got 11 inches of ice under you. Does that give you a sense of how cold things are? The bleak winter of 1684, gambling, ice skating, bear baiting all took place on the river. The ground is frozen solid. No plowing or planting of crops could take place. 1684 remains the coldest winter in the English instrumental record, still to be beaten. And these are people trying to get to the bottom of the ice and find the Thames. Okay, that's England, but the same thing is happening over much of the rest of the world. And may I add, and I'll say in a moment, and the Americas. And some of the things that happen in the Americas are quite interesting. Hunger. It is a very hungry society. It's a society of desperate people who are looking for scapegoats, who are looking for enemies. And if you look at those years between 1677 and 1682, you'll find enemies. In England, for instance, it's the great age of what is called the Popish plot, when the English government has decided that Catholics are going to try and kill the king, launch a coup, take over the government, and they have to be hunted out, they have to be tortured, they have to be killed, as they are in several dozens. And interestingly, and don't attempt to read that, it's just to give you an idea of, this is the horrid, hellish Popish plot as opposed to all the others. And that's a musical piece based on it at the time. If you're in London at the time, there were very spectacular anti-papal demonstrations, which were legendary. And they would construct these huge statues, huge figures of the Pope, surrounded by demons whispering in his ear. And then they'd burn it. And the sound effects would be remarkable because, as they would always do, they would stuff those figures with cats. And yeah, I know. Not exactly the same thing happens in other countries. Only the names are changed. In France, they go after witches and devil worshippers. By the way, the Black Mass, the Satanic Mass, is invented in 1678. And it's invented by the traditional Roman law system of, did you do this? Did you do this? Yes, honest, stop torturing me. So he admitted to this, and thus was the Black Mass born. It is one of the greatest ages of witchcraft persecutions, 1675 to 85, mainly in countries like Sweden. The last witch who we know to have been executed by trial in England is 1682. And by the way, this sets off a huge debate in particularly the British academic world. By this point, the Enlightenment's coming in. Locke and Hobbes and these ideas are around. And yet you've got all these witch trials, and there's a fierce debate going around. And there are people who are writing books saying, you say there is no devil, you say there's no demons. How do you explain everything that's happened? And a famous book appears at this point called The Triumph of Sadducism, Sadducismus Triumphatus, which is, if you'll pardon the expression, which basically gives the story of every witch and ghost and possession and poltergeist, and it makes great reading. But every time after that somebody wants to justify a witch hunt, they turn to that book. It's 1681. By the way, so many of these dates, you can come back to 1680, 1681. This is a what else could happen if you think God is angry with you. How about a comet in 1680? Very interesting. You have the Great Comet of 1680, which is really significant because it's the first ever comet to be detected by telescope. Does that give you an idea of how science has moved forward? But everyone knows it's what we call a bad star, or as the Italian word is, disaster. That's what a disaster is. It's an age of disaster. So, as I say, this is an age when people can discover comets by telescopes, and it produces some of the absolute most florid images of Sabbaths. Remember those Jews and witches with their Sabbaths? Of a whole alternative kingdom. All these people going off into the woods, being imagined, celebrating these satanic rites. How does this affect Christianity? Well, first of all, it affects the theological ideas of the supernatural, okay? But also, all around Europe, there are Christians who are being persecuted by other Christians. And they respond by doing what John Bunyan of Pilgrim's Progress wrote in 1678, flee from the wrath to come. It had to be 1678, didn't it? The book is published 1678, bear with me. Who are these people? There's a major rebellion in Scotland, for example. Scottish Presbyterians, radicals, the Covenanters, rise against the government. They're brutally repressed, and they flee from the wrath to come. So many of them travel to the Americas, where they will merge with the Scottish and the Scotch-Irish. They're overwhelmingly Presbyterians. And oh, by the way, they also take a custom with them. Because they've been so persecuted in Scotland in the churches, they can't meet in the churches. So what they do is they go out in the fields and they have these vast open-air services and meetings. And they take those to the Americas, where later on they're going to turn into camp meetings. So if you're looking for the origin of the camp meeting tradition, look back to the persecutions and the climate crisis of 1679. There are very strong radical Quaker movements in Britain at this time. The pressure on them, the persecution becomes so intense that when William Penn is given Pennsylvania in 1682, they move en masse. Up until 1682, Wales is a very strong Quaker heartland. By 1690, it isn't. They've all gone to Pennsylvania. And if you ever look at a map of Pennsylvania and you see those names like Haverford and Radnor and so on, it probably explains why Mr. Penn wanted to call the area New Wales, but they said, no, I liked your dad, we're going to have it Pennsylvania, sorry. We find these migrant communities. We find Calvinists. We find Presbyterians. We find Quakers. And in some ways, the most important of them all. In the 16th century, the French Catholics had a war with their Protestant minority. They signed an edict of toleration called the Edict of Nun in the early 1680s with so much evidence around of the evils of this minority that is making God so angry. He is punishing our world. In 1685, the King of France revoked the Edict of Nun and sent a couple of 100,000 Protestants, Huguenots, into exile around the world. If you map where they go, you see several things. You see the creation of new Christian religious traditions. You also see the foundations of European Christianity in different parts of the Americas. This is the foundation of much of the white settlement of South Africa, which is Dutch and Huguenot. You will find Huguenot settlement all over the American colonies, all over Protestant Europe. They bring distinctive religious ideas with them, they bring commercial progress, and they contribute mightily to laying the foundations of a prosperous Western Christian Europe with its imperialist bent. Well, surely nothing else can happen as a result of this. Oh yeah, one other one, which is kind of interesting. The Catholic powers in the Holy Roman Empire persecute their Protestants. Their Protestants are a very tough bunch indeed, particularly in Hungary. They rise under a famous warlord called Imre Törköly. And Imre Törköly, a Hungarian Calvinist, tries to invite in to save him the Ottoman Islamic Turks. And that launches a war, which is one of the most important wars in European history. By 1683, the Ottomans are on the verge of conquering Vienna, conquering much of Central Europe. They're driven back by the Catholic powers, especially the Poles. And that war, which grows out of what? Climate crisis, persecution, rebellion, is what will lead to the exclusion of Islam from much of Central and Southeastern Europe. Do you get the feeling that a lot happens between 1675 and 85? And I'll just say this very briefly. A whole lot also happens in the Americas. I won't go into this in detail just on grounds of time. The late 1670s are an absolutely horrendous time for weather in most of the American colonies, the English colonies and the Spanish colonies. In Virginia, for example, you have, what do you have? You have hurricanes, droughts, everything that possibly can happen does happen. Who is responsible? In that case, it's the Indians. The government is not being sufficiently strong against those Indians, and that's what drives Bacon's Rebellion. It's a very important moment in colonial history. And the other thing that's very interesting is that in 1680, you get one of the absolutely pivotal moments in Indian history, American Indian history, when the Pueblos of New Mexico rise, and don't just rise, they actually kick out the Spaniards under a man called Pope, who's an enormous hero to the Pueblo these days. Where did that come from? Read the account of the years after 1675. Famines in which people are reduced to basically eating hides. When the Spanish, not just the Indians, are eating anything they can find. Mass starvation, mass death. The Indians return to their native faith. The Spanish persecute them as witches and sorcerers. In 1680, as a result of this climate-driven catastrophe, the Pueblo rise and kick out the Spanish, and they hold them out for 12 years. Why does it take 12 years? Because when the Spanish tried to launch a major invasion in 1681 into New Mexico, they can't get through the snow. Does that give you an idea of how climate is shaping things? And as I said, this episode is sort of memorialized and one of the great turning points, as I say, in American Indian history. I mentioned 1741. It's hard to pile on the horrors. Almost certainly what happened in 1740-41, and this is one I've never found a satisfactory explanation of. I am virtually certain that there must be a giant volcano gone off somewhere. I know a volcano that erupts in Japan around the right time, but it's honestly not big enough to cause the damage that we actually see. This is a very fine climate historian, Timo Mielenthals. Many of the best records are in Scandinavia. 20 months from December 1739 to September 1741, bizarre climate conditions prevailed across the continent, causing what has become known in the British Isles as the Great Frost, claimed to have turned Ireland into an Arctic country. This is a time when you really have to be concerned, if you're sailing, if you're fishing, if you're boat building, of icebergs in places where you never thought there would be icebergs. In the Americas, the York River in Virginia froze at Williamsburg. Francis Lewis, who went on to sign the Declaration of Independence, wrote this great memoir of how he traveled from Barnstaple on Cape Cod to New York, a 200-mile distance, on his sleigh, watching the frozen seas. Does that give you an idea of cold? You think of the cold, you think of the starvation. How do you interpret it, if not in the sense of, first of all, we have no aid in this world. God is angry. No one ever said we are sinners in the hands of an angry climate, but maybe they should have done. And some of the accounts you get here, there's one very well-quoted author called Joshua Coffin, who wrote a history of Newburyport and West Newbury in Mass. And he just lists these weather disasters from 1739 to 41. And he says, by this point, this is April, there are 4 feet of snow, nobody can move, everything's waterlogged, it's a catastrophe. And then right at the end of it, he says this: sometime this year commenced in this county and town the remarkable revival of religion, which commenced under the preaching of the Reverend Jonathan Edwards in 1735, continued by Whitfield, Tennant, and many others. This agitated not only New England, but the whole country. In other words, the ideas are there, but it's in 39, 40, 41 that they explode. We often hear about charismatic preachers, right? We hear about charismatic leaders, charismatic speakers. I'm always very skeptical of that idea. Somebody who may be charismatic to one person isn't to another. When we talk about a charismatic person, what we mean is somebody whose message exactly fits that of his or her audience. And there are people who are so desperate, so in need of comfort and consolation and an interpretation of the world, they will find it. Always remember, leadership is a function of followership. And the followers and the audience are in place. And you have these great leaders like George Whitefield. If only there was a fine recent biography of George Whitefield. Oh yeah, there is. You've no idea how I'm taking my life in my hands in this section, because there's much fine writing about the Great Awakening and Whitefield, and it was done by him. So he's sitting there glaring inside, however he may look. And when you look at this period, you know, here's something about the way we write history. People write religious history, right? They write political history. They write economic history. But don't forget, all those histories are happening at the same time and affecting the same planet, and often the same town. So what else is happening in 1741? If you're around in 1741, what's happened? Well, you've seen the snow, you've seen the ice, you've seen the hunger, you've seen the disease, you've seen all these bad things. And we don't hear so much about it in the context of the Awakening. But it's also the time when you have one of the great moments of paranoia in early American history. There are genuine slave revolts through American history, but New York in 1741 has one of the stunners, which is not only a slave revolt, that is, the black slaves are about to burn the city down and destroy it, but they're doing this at the behest of Catholics. And they're executing, this is New York, this is total equal opportunity. They're executing whites, blacks. They're executing Catholics in significant numbers. Fired several dwelling and other houses there within a few days succeeding, and by another attempt made in prosecution of the same infernal scheme, putting fire between two other dwelling houses within the said city. Catholics are being hanged on the gallows that have just executed black slaves. There are dozens of executions. Hundreds of people are arrested in a city which by this point has a population of what, 15,000, 2,000? It's a catastrophe. And if you saw the date on that one, you'll see that's a 1744. But the actual events are all 1741, and then it moves into 42. If you are one of Jonathan Edwards' listeners, this is the world you know. I've talked about hating, I've talked about fleeing, I've talked about reviving. What decides whether one happens rather than the other? Technology. Whether you can travel, whether there are ships, whether there are media that will report how strong the government is, whether the government has a police force. You know, this is a great time in witchcraft prosecutions. I found cases by the 1740s where a man will say, yeah, she's a witch. And another one will say, no, she's not. And what they do is they take her along to a local doctor to examine her for witch marks, and one guy wins the bet. They've sort of given up taking witchcraft quite as seriously by this point. Governments get stronger. One great episode, and there's something written about this, happens in 1816. A volcano erupts in 1815 called Tambora in what we'd call Indonesia today. Spreads a cloud around the world, reduces temperatures, causes astonishing flooding, very, very heavy rains. You've probably heard a little bit about this in recent years because people have written about the effects. And they have all sorts of miscellaneous effects. So for instance, there's this aristocratic house party in Switzerland in 1818. and they're planning to go out and do stuff, but the sky is so dark and the storms are going and the rain is going, so what they have to do is stay at home, and they're going to write stories. And this woman here writes Frankenstein, and this guy here writes the first modern vampire book, and modern horror fiction is a direct consequence of this. And this is all good, clean fun. It's a kind of dreaming. But what happens in many places around the world is there are many individuals who may be in their teens, they may be children, but they're so transformed by seeing these events that they have visions, that they report visions, and in some cases they form whole religions. In 1820, Joseph Smith in upstate New York claimed to have seen what he called the first vision, which laid the foundation of the Book of Mormon, the Latter-day Saints. And you think, what's he doing in upstate New York? Well, his family had to move because of the catastrophic weather and crop failures. It's 1816, 1817, when he's 11 and 12 years old, that he's hearing all this news about the dreadful things that are happening. And he can't fail to be focused on apocalypse. Another guy who's very struck at this time is a man called William Miller, who is, it's at this point where he gets his views of the end of the world that are going to shape the Adventist tradition in the 1830s and 1840s. And so I ask you, as we look to a near future world, not 1740, but 2040, what we can reasonably predict is warming, not cooling. We can predict significantly higher temperatures, particularly in areas which have seen the greatest Christian and Muslim growth. There are presently around 3 billion Christians in the world, and that number will grow, but virtually all the growth will take place in Africa. By 2050, for the first time ever, there'll be over 1 billion Christians on one continent. It will be Africa. The vast majority of them will live in lands that are dependent on the African Great Lakes, those lakes that feed the Nile and the Congo and those other rivers. Those Great Lakes are already in crisis. Those are going to be the main targets of global warming over the coming decades. What will happen? Will we see a new era of hating, of people turning against each other? Rwandan genocide of the 1990s was in part driven by climatic and environmental change and increased resources. We're talking about a much greater level. This is the greatest age of Islamic growth around the world. The fastest growing Muslim communities, fastest growing Christian communities next to each other in countries like Uganda, for example, or Kenya. Fleeing, well, yeah, we're already there. Just look at the people now and in the last few years migrating from Africa, from the Sahel into Europe. Look at those routes across Libya, across the Mediterranean. Look at the political, cultural revolutions that is already having in Europe between nativists, populists, people who are open to immigration. Then take those numbers and multiply them by 10. Reviving and dreaming. Will we see whole new prophets and thinkers who respond to those apocalyptic conditions? Well, I don't know. As I say, I'm a professor, not a prophet, but there's a phrase I always like, and I will end with. Back in the 1680s, once again, there was a man called the Marquis of Halifax who wrote these very wise comments, but one of them I think we could usefully take as a motto. The best way, he wrote, to suppose what is the best way to suppose what may come is to remember what is past. The best qualification of a prophet is to have a good memory, experience, maketh more prophets than revelations. Thank you. Anyone who wishes to, pardon the expression, flee may do so. And then I'm here for any questions or argument or discussion or irate interjections. So flee from the wrath to come. Come on. A silence fell over the room. Please.
I don't know much about Africa, but I didn't know that it was growing so much in Christianity.
Oh, yeah.
That's a striking statistic that it would be the first continent to have 1 billion Christians. That's what you said?
Yeah, and actually the figures, Africa in 1900 had 10 million Christians. That number had grown to 500 million by 2015, and it will be at least 1 billion by 2050. And by that point, it'll be much the heart of Christianity. And that does not count African diaspora communities, which should add another, I don't know, 100 million. Wow. Yeah, that's my view. Yeah. And, you know, here's an interesting thing which maybe we haven't put together. We talk about Christianity, we talk about faith and the environment. Well, okay, maybe here's one of the most important statistics. The areas with the most Christians and the most Christian growth are also precisely those areas that are most likely to be hit hard by climate change. The most intense religious conflict around the world, not just between Christians and Muslims, but Christians and Hindus, Hindus and Muslims, is along what's called the 10th parallel, which is the line that runs around the world 10 degrees north of the equator. That is right in the middle of that tropical area, which will, by any reasonable standard, be heating most. You can have all sorts of debates about climate change and warming. You can look at the causes. You can wonder how much of it is human caused. You can have these legitimate debates. But all the present trends are looking at the most growth in, if you like, the belt around the equator. That is also the religious heart of our planet and of our future. So if you ever want to know why the religious side of things relates to the environmental, there's a good argument right there. Please.
So the Islamic migration
Yeah.
into Europe is a pretty well-documented phenomenon over several decades. Recently, Ross Dalfat was writing about African Christian migration to Europe. Do you have any? You're not a crystal ball, but you're a historian, and do you have? Are you willing to speculate about the future of Europe? Not as much in racial matters as religious matters.
Well, it's funny, I refer to my 2007 book, God's Continent, about the future religion of Europe, and that may allow me to say something. Well, boy, much of the Islamic growth in Europe is not historically connected with climate change. It's straight economic migration, people moving to richer countries. There are lots of different ways in which you can look at that migration. For instance, in France, so if you have a lot of people who are a foreign immigrant community, what do you call them? And what they've traditionally said is, oh, these are Muslims. Well, you could equally say that a whole lot of them are black Africans. So you can see it as a race issue as much as a religious issue. In Great Britain, for example, if you look at some of the towns, the old industrial towns in the north of England, people draw a distinction between Muslims and whites. Not Muslims and Christians, Muslims and whites. And I think that's important. So it very much depends how you count people. In my view, European governments have actually encouraged the growth of quite radical Islamic sentiment by basically telling people, we are going to count you as Muslims. You must look to these Muslim community leaders, whereas the people just want to often assimilate. So they stand in the way of that. the Christian presence in Europe is so remarkable as an immigrant phenomenon. The 4 largest mega churches in Great Britain, and yeah, there are mega churches in Great Britain, are all pastored by Africans. You see Nigerians, you see Ghanaians. If you look at the French-speaking countries, you see usually Congolese. Also Asians, you get Vietnamese around the place. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the wonderful story of a guy called Sunday Adelaja. I'll say the story because it is sort of nice one. Sunday Adelaja was a Nigerian. He went to the former Soviet Union in its last days when they were trying to recruit bright people from the third world to go off and lead Marxist-Leninist revolution. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, so he's stuck in the Ukraine. So he founds a church with a few followers. That congregation he founded is now the largest congregation in Europe. It's the mother church is in excess of 50,000 people, overwhelmingly white, led by black Africans. And you may be thinking, what do you do with a congregation of 50,000? Where do you put it? But the good news is, this is a former Soviet territory in the Ukraine. And so the Soviets were very big on building these giant halls for party congresses and unions and so on. And that they've been taken over by the churches. So if you've ever wondered what the historic role of Soviet communism was, it was to build buildings large enough for African Pentecostal churches. But the point I'm making is we hear a lot about the Islamic takeover of Europe, and we hear phrases like that. There are a lot of Muslims in Europe. There's also a lot of immigrant Christians, and don't forget those, and they're a very important phenomenon. And in some ways, I see it as different from the U.S. I mean, there's a lot of immigrant Christians in the U.S., from Africa, whatever, and they seem to be adding new layers to existing churches. Okay? In Europe, you might see a degree of replacement. If a church goes out of use in an American city, what happens to it? It becomes a church, right? Very often an immigrant church. If a church goes out of use in Europe, it becomes what? A warehouse, a mosque, you know? So I think that's a fundamental part of the future of Christianity worldwide, because some of these churches are founded in Europe, and then they go back and evangelize hometowns in Africa. And this whole story is of prime Texas interest, given, of course, that Houston is the Nigerian capital of the United States. And if you ever want to see African churches in operation, go to Houston and go to places like Katy, and you will see them rip-roaring. It's kind of encouraging. But I can talk about any of this, but my point is that's a very different phenomenon from the kind of mass climate refugee situations that we've got in the last few years. You know, if you look at the situation in the Mediterranean in the last few years, it is far, far worse than anything that has ever existed along the US-Mexican border. You know how many people have died of thirst and so on in the desert along the US and Mexican border. The number of people who drown in the Mediterranean trying to get across is horrendous. And they are leaving areas that are drying up and have dried up, which is why I sometimes say whenever I talk about this, the future of our planet is written in water. Anyone else? Please, sir.
Yes, you briefly mentioned the Little Ice Age and the historians in China. They're kind of dying out in that region.
Yeah.
That from Christianity. Do you find any direct evidence that linked kind of their downfall to climate and being seen as outsiders?
There are different degrees of Christian settlement. Christians grow in China, they vanish. They grow in China, they vanish. There is one great expansion from the 11th and 12th centuries. It's partly Church of the East Nestorian. It's partly Latin Christians. And it goes all the way up very nicely until the mid-14th century in the aftermath of the climate disasters and the plagues that follow directly from it. I mean, one reason the Black Death is so severe is it hits a population that's starving, that's got no resistance. And you have this nationalist revolution in 1368, which basically sets up this nationalist dynasty, rules for a couple hundred years, and virtually the whole Christian presence in China vanishes in 1368. The 1360s are a catastrophe, a disaster across China, across Persia, across Iraq. And normally you can see some kind of continuity from one of these waves of Chinese Christianity to the next one, but 1368 just seems to be the gulf. Nothing seems to last through. They die or they're subject to forced conversion. It's fairly extreme. So please.
You've been speaking about these four largely Christian but religious responses
Yep.
to climate change and disaster. How do secular responses compare? Do we know much about them?
See, one problem is in the eras I'm talking about, there aren't secular responses really. It's really difficult to be an atheist or a secularist in these early periods. And some people are forced to pay lip service to these ideas and really don't believe them. But those religious ideas are so permeating and so absolute. Now, you may be wondering sort of what happens to these great catastrophes like the 1740-41 one, and as society gets better organized so it can resist them. So by the time you get to the 1880s, you get the explosion of Krakatoa, which is enormous. It's smaller than Tambora, but it's still big. It drops global temperature by about 1 degree Celsius. And normally that would be very, very bad. And for several years, you have the temperature drop, has some impact on crops, but governments are and states are much better prepared to deal with the crisis by that point. You have canned goods. You can export food from continent to continent. And so by the time of the 1880s, it's not a cataclysm. It's a glitch. Okay? Governments get better. And if you deal with something like a volcanic intervention with a relatively limited effect, they can do that. Oh, by the way, you started off saying something very important. Please understand, I'm not suggesting that what I'm talking about here entirely is a matter of Christianity. I can also give me another lecture, and I can talk about the impact on other religions, particularly Islam. And it's kind of interesting, in the great age of reviving in the 1740s, that is when the great Jewish movement of Hasidism really takes wings and expands. It's the great age of this great prophetic figure, the Baal Shem Tov. So you can see it in other religions also. But secularists in earlier eras were a rare breed. It was really hard to be an atheist. And even people who are described as atheists, when you scratch them a bit, they'll say, he's a vicious heretic. He just believes that God made the world but doesn't look after it anymore. So it's not exactly atheism. So.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. But you've just made the case that the refugee crises, if you put it that way, in Europe are due to climate change.
Partly.
What if I put it to you that it's more due to economic and political reasons than warfare? What would your response be? Are they not more imminent and powerful drivers?
My response would be, particularly if you look at North Africa, it is impossible to separate the economic crises, the poverty, and the warfare from climate. And I would urge you to look, for instance, at climate change around the Sahel. The threat to water supplies, conflict over water supplies, how that drives intercommunal conflict, how that drives starvation, how that drives urbanization as people have to flee to urban areas. it's very hard to separate these out, but we are already in a significant way over the last 15 years or so in the Great Lakes region in the Sahel, seeing very significant evidence of a climate impact. And as the phrase goes, all the indicators seem to be up. A very interesting book that I might commend to you here, someone called Eliza Griswold, who wrote a book called The 10th Parallel. And she did this really intrepid, and many would say foolhardy thing, of going around the 10th parallel, speaking to all these communities, at the key epicenters of religious tension. And time again, what's it about? It's about water. It's about climatic change. It's, the sea used to go to here, the lake used to go to here, and now it's there. What are we going to do? So I hear what you're saying, but it's very hard to factor out that climate element.
Okay, but just to come back to you, there is the issue of cause and effect. And
Of course.
if you look at California, there's a water crisis there, but it's not necessarily climate change. It's taking too much water from mono lakes to feed the lawn, to spray on the lawns in
Right.
Los Angeles and so on.
No,
So,
undoubtedly.
there is water shortage, but it's not climate in that case. Although I agree with you that climate is the big driver.
I would actually add one thing, which is one of the famines that people know best today was what occurred in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa in the 80s. And that was not climate-driven. That was entirely a government matter. That was a government-driven catastrophe. Purposeful. We might call it a genocide. So please understand, I am not standing here being, monocausal, but I'm emphasizing the likelihood of that climate element being stronger in years to come. One more. Yeah, please. How are we doing?
Here?
Yeah, no.
So in light of this perhaps prophetic claim you have, what would your biggest exhortation be to us going forward from here?
Oh, boy. I go back to this quote from Halifax, which is, if you want to know the future, know something about the past, which is know where we've been, what some of the possible consequences are, and don't be amazed when the future hits. And somebody, this does not exactly answer your question, but somebody could write a great book about the response of the US government and intelligence community to 9/11, when it very rapidly became apparent that they had absolutely no idea what the ideological content of Qaeda was. They were left prey to really ill-qualified people claiming to be experts who gave them views that they held for a year or two before other people came along and said, you have to be kidding. My favorite moment in US policymaking in the Middle East was in 1979, when the Iranians took a lot of US hostages in Tehran, drawing forth from the then Vice President Walter Mondale the legendary quote, "What in hell is an Ayatollah anyway?" And I would just like to see some sense of the likely consequences expressed in religious terms, because that's where a lot of it is going to be. And I will also tell you, if you look at these countries and you look at the aid agencies on the ground, and they want to talk to and work with local people, A, the vast majority are churches, and B, the vast majority of them are churches with strong apocalyptic ideologies. But these are still the people you want to talk to if you want to get food and medical supplies to your communities. So, exhortation is not my strong suit, but I suppose it's a matter of knowing the past in order to know the future. But like I say, this goes beyond all kind of climate change debates. There's lots of room to argue about stuff. There's lots of room to argue about the history. Lots of room to argue about causation, as we just illustrated. But that underlying fact of where likely warming is going to hit is so well supported, it's very hard to get round. How do you deal with it? Anyone else? Please.
I realize the question behind my question now, which is this, and maybe you can't answer this as an historian. Is the problem that you're describing a religious one or a human one? In other words, clearly you can say this is a failure of the church to act this way, failure of Christianity. Is it, are the causes for these responses somehow intrinsic to Christian faith? Or is this just a failure of the church to reach within the tradition and find proper ways of responding according to the gospel? And is what we're looking at just what humans do when things turn south?
Or as the phrase goes about the 14th century, and there is an article with this title, When the Weather Gets Medieval on Us. I did not mean to suggest that the kind of situations we're seeing here are the result of misdoing by the church, by the churches. Very often the churches are trying very hard to control and regulate and counteract some of the excesses that are emerging from people. People just being people. So, one pope, one bishop may drive a witch hunt, and another may try very hard to prevent it. One may try and drive anti-Semitism, another may try and prevent it. It's certainly not anything straightforward. And you see exactly the same things across the interfaith spectrum. You see Hindus behaving badly, you see Muslims behaving badly, and so on. And you think with some of these crises, like in 1320 or 1680, you genuinely wonder what on earth anyone could do. If a modern government today had to deal with a climate change as rapid and as extreme as either of those two dates, would it do better? Yes. Would it prevent catastrophe? Would it prevent suspicion and paranoia completely separate from any religious body? No, I don't think so. And if there's one thing we've learned in modern times, if you really want to see serious homicidal paranoia focused on a government and a regime, you don't have to look at religious bodies. If you look at the bloodiest regimes in history, they're staunchly secular. Okay, folks. Well, at that point, I will let you go and I'll say thank you very much.